So in my last few posts, I've been looking at the lazy loading of feature modules in an Angular application. Now, in order to lazy load a module, what we have to do is in our router provide a load children property instead of a children property that has a whole collection of static route configuration. Now, when a user navigates to path feature A, Angular will see that there's a load children and it will fetch this code from the server and it will import this module into the application. Now that happens on demand during the user's navigation, but the Angular router allows us to preload lazy loaded features in the application such that they hopefully become available before the user even actively navigates to them. And doing that is super simple. All we have to do is go into our application module, which uses the router module, and I'm going to import this preload all modules strategy. And down here in our router module for root, where we have our option to provide additional configuration settings, I'm going to do preloading strategy, and I'm going to tell it to preload all modules. Now, if we jump over into the browser and we refresh so we can see the network activity, what you can see here is that the first couple of requests are the main bundles, right? Main, vendor, runtime. And then these other 2, 3, 4, and 1, these are the feature modules for feature A, B, aside, and there's a sub thing in B as well. And because these are loaded now right after the bootstrap, and actually if we look at the waterfall flow here, you can see here are the initial requests for the main bundles. And then after the application is bootstrapped and becomes responsive, here's where you can see the other 4 features. And because of that, now if we navigate to one of the lazy loaded features, you can see there's no additional network activity because those lazy loaded modules have already been preloaded into the application. Super cool. Now, this got me thinking about my loading indicator from my previous demo, and let's actually take a quick look at that code. If we jump over into our component, what that was looking at before were these router config load start and router config load end events. Now, in the previous demo, those were firing when the user navigated to the lazy loaded module. In a preloading scenario, these 2 events still fire in the application. It's just that they're not firing as part of a navigation event, they're firing as part of a preloading workflow. Right? If we were to log this out, we would see that these things still happen. And what that means now is that if we want to show a loading indicator, we have to make our application a little bit more, our application logic a little bit more sensitive to the type of events that can happen. So instead of just looking at the config events, what we have to do is also look at the navigation events, right? Because we don't want to show the loading indicator if it's part of the preloading strategy, but we do want to show the loading indicator if it's making a config request during an active navigation. So now, instead of just keeping track of how many config loads I'm doing, I need to also keep track of pending navigation. Now, you'll see that I'm just looking at the start event here for navigation. I'm incrementing that counter just as I did the async load count. And then anytime a navigation ends, either successfully or an error, I'm decrementing that same counter. And now, instead of just basing the loading indicator on the async load count, I only want to show when there is both an active navigation and an active config fetch taking place. Now to see this, what we can do is come back here into the demo and go into a slow connection. And now that we're on a slow G, let's make sure we're in the root of the application. If we refresh now, what we'll see is it'll take a couple of seconds for this to load because it's about 500K in our vendor bundle. And what you want to notice is that when this loads, there's going to be no loading indicator. So this has to get to about 500K. Give it a second. Okay, so now start to watch it, and you'll see that there's going to be no loading module indicator here. While those values are being fetched in the background, it happens completely transparently. The user doesn't know about it, and now, of course, if I go to the lazy loaded features, you can see that there's 0 latency there because, again, those are already loaded. And that's because even though we were performing that config request, there was no active navigation, and therefore we did not show the loading indicator. But what happens if the user's initial request to the application is to a lazy loaded feature? So for example, feature B is a lazy loaded feature. And now let's refresh with the initial request being in feature B. At this point, again, we have to get to 500K here. At this point, the initial request is going to be fulfilled right after the bootstrap, which means that there is an active navigation. So if you start to watch now, what you'll see is there's immediately a loading module indicator, and that's because the application was trying to navigate to that feature B module because of the URL that the user entered, and it was trying to do that while it was also making fetches for the remote lazy loaded feature modules. So what we're able to do now is preload all of our feature modules in order to make the app as quick to first interaction as possible while also delaying any latency for subsequent navigations, but we're also still providing that positive feedback to the user in the case where they're expecting a UI to render, but the code behind that UI is not yet available in the Angular application. So anyway, I mean, this took almost no effort, right? It was doing the one import of PreloadAllModules, providing that as a configuration in the routing module services, and then just doing a little bit of update in our logic here to determine when we want to show that loading indicator, and everything just worked. And you know, I know that the Angular router has had some quirks, and there are definitely some issues with it, but it's just, I've always been a huge fan of what they were trying to do, especially with all the secondary routes and having multiple route states in the URL at the same time. I think that's super, super powerful. And seeing things like this preloading of lazy loaded modules essentially work with practically no effort is I don't know, it's just super exciting, I think.